In the heart of rural Oregon, nestled among peaceful fruit orchards, a respected businessman is found dead in his bed. No blood, no weapon, no suspects. What began as a quiet mystery quickly spiraled into one of the most controversial investigations in small-town America. Was it a crime of passion, a cover-up, or something far more sinister? For over 2 decades, this case has haunted Hood River, and today we're pulling back the curtain, fact by fact, to uncover what really happened to Eric Tamiyasu. Stick with us, because sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that never get solved. Eric Tamiyasu was born and raised in Hood River, Oregon, a quiet town nestled in the agricultural heart of the Pacific Northwest. From an early age, Eric was immersed in the rhythms of orchard life. His family owned and operated a fruit orchard, and Eric's deep connection to the land would come to define both his career and his legacy. After studying agricultural sciences in college, he returned to Hood River with a clear vision to modernize and expand the family business. Through his efforts, the orchard saw technological improvements, increased efficiency, and long-term sustainability. His dedication helped solidify the farm's place as a respected pillar of the local agricultural community. Eric was widely regarded as hardworking, intelligent, and generous. He valued both tradition and innovation, carefully balancing the two as he led the orchard into a new era. Beyond his business, Eric was deeply embedded in the Hood River community. He maintained close relationships with friends and neighbors, frequently offering support, advice, and help without expectation. Those who knew him often described him as soft-spoken, humble, and quietly driven. He had a calm presence that inspired trust and confidence among those around him. Among his closest confidants was Don Dixon, a business consultant and longtime friend. Their relationship spanned both personal and professional boundaries. Don was not only someone Eric trusted with business matters, but also someone he counted on socially. Their friendship was well known in Hood River, where the two men were often seen working together or attending local events. Don's involvement in Eric's life would later become significant, especially following Eric's sudden and tragic death. At the time of his passing, Eric was 41 years old and had never been married. He had recently begun a new romantic relationship, but his focus remained on his orchard and the people who mattered most to him. In early June 2001, Eric Tamiyasu entered a new chapter in his personal life. At 41 years old, the longtime orchard owner and businessman began a romantic relationship with Diana Anderson, a friend he had known for years. Their relationship, still fresh and unfolding, brought a sense of change to Eric's otherwise structured and quiet life. The couple spent time together at Eric's remote residence, a home tucked into the hills of Hood River County along B.S. Hill Road. Surrounded by fruit trees and isolated by nature, Eric's property offered privacy and peace, a fitting retreat for someone who lived by the land. One evening, while Diana was visiting Eric at his home, they both experienced something that stood out sharply from the tranquility they expected. According to reports, the two heard strange knocking sounds outside the house. Moments later, the doorbell rang. When they went to check, no one was there. The incident left them both uneasy. No explanation was ever found, and it remains one of the few clues tied to the days leading up to Eric's death. That night, the quiet of Eric's property became unsettling. Shortly after this date, Eric became difficult to reach. Between June 8th and June 10th, friends noticed his sudden and uncharacteristic silence. Calls went unanswered. Messages were left with no reply. Those closest to Eric began to grow concerned. He was known to be consistent and communicative, especially with friends and business contacts. His absence was not only felt, it was alarming. By June 11th, that concern escalated. Don Dixon, a trusted friend and business consultant, decided to check on Eric in person. Don had a spare key to Eric's home and let himself in. What he found would mark the beginning of a troubling mystery. Inside the bedroom, Don discovered Eric's body lying in bed. The room was filled with the unmistakable odor of decomposition. Eric was nude, unresponsive, and clearly deceased. From appearances alone, there were no signs of trauma or forced entry. The home showed no signs of a struggle. Everything appeared still, unnaturally so. Don called 911 immediately after the discovery. The authorities arrived at the residence shortly afterward. From the initial observations, it was presumed that Eric had died of natural causes. No blood, bullet holes, or shell casings were visible at the scene. With no obvious injuries or damage in the room, the assumption was that Eric had passed away in his sleep. At this point, the focus remained on notifying family, documenting the scene, and preparing for a coroner's evaluation. The events that had taken place in the preceding days remained unclear. The timeline was fragile. What had caused Eric's sudden disappearance from daily life? Was the knocking incident merely a coincidence, or was it tied to something more sinister? With Eric's body now found and questions mounting, the quiet routine of his life gave way to uncertainty. This discovery ended the search for Eric. But it marked only the beginning of the investigation into what really happened at his secluded home. Eric Tamiyasu's home, located deep within his family's orchard on B.S. Hill Road, became the center of a tragic and confounding discovery in June 2001. Isolated, quiet, and nestled among fruit trees, the house offered few signs to the outside world of the events unfolding inside. After several days of silence from Eric, Don Dixon, his close friend and business associate, used a spare key to enter the property and check on him. Upon walking into the bedroom, he found Eric lying nude on the bed. The room was filled with the overpowering odor of decomposition. Eric's body had clearly been there for days. Visually, there were no signs of trauma. There was no blood visible anywhere in the room. The bed, while stained from decomposition, did not indicate any apparent violence. There were no bullet holes in the walls or bedding. No shell casings were found on the floor. The windows and doors appeared undisturbed, and the house showed no evidence of forced entry. Based on the initial scene, authorities, including Hood River County Sheriff Joe Wampler, presumed Eric had died of natural causes. No autopsy had yet been performed, and the condition of the body made external wounds difficult to detect without closer examination. Shortly after first responders arrived, Sheriff Wampler made a decision that would become one of the most controversial elements of the case. He instructed Don Dixon to dispose of the bed and bedding, specifically to burn them. According to Wampler, the action was meant to shield the Tamiyasu family from further trauma. However, this decision would later draw intense criticism. Burning the bedding likely destroyed critical forensic evidence, including gunshot residue, trace blood spatter, and fibers that could have played a key role in understanding the circumstances of Eric's death. At the time, neither Wampler nor Dixon could have known that the initial assumption of natural causes would soon be overturned. But even so, the destruction of the bed prevented any future forensic analysis that might have contradicted that assumption. Experts later pointed out that even minor blood patterns or residue invisible to the naked eye could have been crucial. The absence of shell casings or obvious wounds might have been misleading, especially if the firearm used was small caliber, such as a .22. The scene's integrity was further compromised by the lack of detailed documentation prior to the bed's disposal. Photographs and notes were taken, but without the physical evidence preserved, the scene could never be reconstructed. What may have been learned from the fabric, the mattress, or even the positioning of the body was lost. Investigators would later admit that the decision to burn the bedding severely limited their ability to pursue forensic leads. Adding to the complexity was a detail shared by Diana Anderson, Eric's new romantic partner. She reported that on the night she had last visited Eric's home, just days before his body was found, they had both heard knocking and the doorbell ringing. When they looked outside, no one was there. After Eric's body was discovered, Diana also mentioned noticing a single footprint near the property, a detail that could have been vital in determining whether someone had been lurking around the house. Unfortunately, this footprint was never properly documented or preserved. By the time law enforcement considered it significant, heavy rain had washed it away. Without a cast or photograph, the footprint became another lost clue. It joined the burned bedding as part of a growing list of evidence that was no longer accessible. In a case where so little was physically known, each piece of potentially useful information held increased value, and each loss became more deeply felt. The scene at Eric Tamiyasu's home might have appeared peaceful on the surface, but beneath that quiet exterior were early decisions that would ultimately hinder the investigation. The destruction of the bed, the delay in reevaluating the cause of death, and the overlooked footprint together shaped a narrative of lost opportunity. What remained was a crime scene stripped of its most telling elements, setting the stage for a homicide case with missing answers from the very beginning. Following the initial discovery of Eric Tamiyasu's body, the absence of visible trauma led law enforcement to suspect natural causes. Given the condition of the remains and the lack of obvious signs of violence, no blood, no bullet holes, no shell casings, the initial narrative focused on an unexplained medical event. Sheriff Joe Wampler, acting under that assumption, instructed the disposal of Eric's bedding. The burned mattress and sheets, along with any trace evidence they may have held, were gone before any forensic pathologist had examined the body. But that assumption unraveled once the autopsy was performed. The report delivered a conclusive and startling diagnosis. Eric had been shot 3 times in the head with a .22 caliber firearm. The discovery immediately transformed the nature of the case. What had been treated as a possible medical tragedy was now confirmed as a homicide. The wounds were not superficial, they were lethal and deliberate. The caliber of the weapon likely contributed to the difficulty in identifying external trauma. A .22 caliber bullet, though small, can be deadly at close range and may leave minimal visible entry wounds, especially in a body already in decomposition. The implications were immediate and far-reaching. The Hood River County Sheriff's Office was forced to reevaluate every step of the case, beginning with the initial response to the scene. The destruction of the bed and bedding now took on a different light. What may have seemed like a gesture of compassion toward the family was now viewed as a serious investigative misstep. The bedding could have held gunshot residue, fibers, blood spatter, or other trace materials, any of which might have assisted in reconstructing the crime or identifying the weapon used. As the investigation reopened, scrutiny shifted toward the decisions made in the earliest hours after the discovery. Law enforcement procedures came into question. Why was a death declared natural without an autopsy? Why was evidence destroyed so quickly? And why had critical scene preservation protocols not been followed? The answers were unsatisfying, especially to those who saw the case grow colder with each lost opportunity. This autopsy served not only as a medical evaluation, but also as the point at which the case was reframed entirely. It exposed the fragility of the early investigation and laid bare the consequences of assumptions made too quickly. From that moment forward, Eric Tamiyasu was no longer simply missing from his community. He was a confirmed victim of homicide, and every choice made before that revelation would now be measured against the standard of what was lost. The investigation into Eric Tamiyasu's death officially began under the jurisdiction of the Hood River County Sheriff's Office, with Sheriff Joe Wampler leading the case. From the outset, the process was defined by critical missteps. The first and most consequential error occurred at the crime scene. When Eric's death was prematurely classified as the result of natural causes. This conclusion, drawn before an autopsy had been performed, influenced every decision made in the immediate aftermath, including the destruction of key physical evidence. The choice to have Don Dixon burn the bed and bedding, approved by Sheriff Wampler, proved to be a pivotal mistake. What was initially seen as an effort to spare the family trauma was later viewed as the elimination of potential forensic evidence. With the autopsy revealing gunshot wounds to the head, the significance of the lost materials became undeniable. Gunshot residue, blood spatter, fibers, and possible DNA traces had all been destroyed, leaving investigators with fewer tools to reconstruct the crime or identify the perpetrator. As scrutiny mounted, attention turned to how the initial scene was handled. The lack of urgency in securing the house, photographing the bedroom, and preserving the surrounding area created a gap in the investigative record. Reports indicate that potential clues, such as the footprint noticed by Diana Anderson near the home, were never formally documented or cast. Heavy rain washed away what may have been a vital link to a suspect. Meanwhile, no murder weapon was ever recovered. Despite the confirmed use of a .22 caliber firearm, searches of the property and surrounding areas yielded no results. Without a weapon, bullet casings, or eyewitness accounts, investigators lacked a clear direction. The failure to locate the firearm compounded the sense that the investigation had been hampered from the start. As word of Eric's homicide spread throughout Hood River, the public's reaction shifted from grief to concern and skepticism. Questions about the sheriff's office quickly gained traction. Why had the scene been declared safe for cleanup so soon? Why hadn't a full forensic team been deployed? Why was a crime not suspected until days later and only after the autopsy was completed? These questions weren't easily answered. The sheriff's office faced increasing criticism, not just from Eric's friends and family, but from members of the broader community. The trust that had existed between law enforcement and the public began to erode. Citizens demanded accountability, clarity, and progress, none of which seemed forthcoming. Even after the case was officially reclassified as a homicide, the investigation struggled to gain traction. Without leads, physical evidence, or a witness, investigators had little to move forward with. There were no public updates, no press conferences with new information, and no arrests. The absence of developments led to growing frustration. Internally, the sheriff's office reviewed its procedures, but no significant disciplinary actions were reported. Sheriff Wampler remained at the center of the investigation, both as its leader and as a figure whose decisions had shaped its flawed foundation. Despite public pressure, he defended his actions and denied any wrongdoing. Ultimately, the early misclassification of Eric's death and the immediate destruction of critical evidence cast a long shadow over the case. Investigators faced the difficult task of solving a homicide without the benefit of a complete crime scene. What remained were fragmented records, a growing list of questions, and a community unsure whether justice would ever be served. The early missteps didn't just affect the case, they may have defined it. As the investigation into Eric Tamiyasu's death deepened, attention turned to several individuals connected to his personal and professional life. Though no one was ever arrested or officially charged, 4 people emerged as key persons of interest based on circumstantial evidence, relationships, and behavior following Eric's death. Theories surrounding each of these individuals formed the basis for the case's most prominent investigative paths. Eric Smith, a longtime friend and business associate of Eric Tamiyasu, was one of the first names to surface. Smith had partnered with Eric in a car business venture prior to the latter's death. Allegations arose, suggesting that Smith may have embezzled as much as $60,000 from the business. Financial disputes are often motivators in homicide investigations, and this alleged conflict cast suspicion on Smith's potential involvement. However, Smith denied any wrongdoing and maintained that his friendship with Eric was strong and mutually respectful. He agreed to a polygraph examination and reportedly passed, providing no further actionable leads. Without physical evidence or testimony implicating him, the case against Smith remains speculative. Next was Sheriff Joe Wampler, the lead investigator on the case. Wampler was responsible for key decisions early in the investigation, including the controversial order to burn Eric's bedding, an action now widely regarded as compromising critical forensic evidence. Rumors also circulated regarding a possible affair between Eric and Wampler's wife, raising questions about a potential personal motive. Wampler denied both the affair and any involvement in the crime. He, too, submitted to a polygraph and passed. Despite the lack of evidence linking him to the murder, the sheriff's dual role as both suspect and lead investigator fueled public distrust and raised concerns about objectivity and accountability. Don Dixon, Eric's close friend and the person who discovered the body, also became a person of interest. Dixon had access to Eric's home and used a spare key to enter the property after friends grew concerned. It was Dixon who first saw the decomposing body and contacted law enforcement. However, his early remarks raised questions. Before the autopsy results were released, Dixon reportedly commented that there were no exit wounds, a detail that would only be known if one were familiar with the nature of the injury. He also initially speculated that Eric may have taken his own life, despite the absence of a weapon at the scene. Dixon agreed to a polygraph, but the results were inconclusive. The combination of his proximity to the victim, unusual statements, and ambiguous polygraph results positioned him as a figure of interest, though no charges were filed. The final person of interest was Diana Anderson's ex-boyfriend. Anderson, who had recently begun dating Eric, told investigators that she and Eric had experienced strange knocking and doorbell ringing during one of her visits to his home. When they investigated, no one was outside. She also recalled seeing a single footprint near the house. Her ex-boyfriend was reportedly known for stalking behavior and may have had unresolved feelings toward Anderson. These elements introduced a potential theory of romantic jealousy. However, the footprint was lost to heavy rain before it could be analyzed, and no physical evidence ever tied Anderson's ex-boyfriend to the crime. Without further proof, this lead went cold. From these individuals, multiple theories emerged, each grounded in real circumstances tied to the investigation. The romantic jealousy theory stemmed from the dynamics between Eric, Diana Anderson, and her ex-boyfriend. If the ex harbored resentment or possessiveness, the nighttime knocking could suggest an attempt at intimidation or surveillance. The theory also encompasses the rumor involving Sheriff Wampler's wife, suggesting that personal betrayal may have been a motive. While neither angle produced direct evidence, the emotional weight of jealousy has historically played a role in similar crimes. A second theory centered on a financial motive. The alleged embezzlement by Eric Smith could have created tension and resentment. If Eric had confronted Smith or planned legal action, this may have prompted retaliation. Though Smith passed a polygraph, investigators could not completely rule out financial motives as a possible cause, especially in the absence of financial records detailing the dispute. A third theory involved police misconduct or cover-up. Sheriff Wampler's involvement from the outset, coupled with his decision to destroy evidence, raised the possibility that actions taken under the guise of compassion may have masked something deeper. Some believed that the destruction of the bed served not just to protect the family from trauma, but also to eliminate incriminating evidence. The rumor about an affair, although denied, gave this theory more traction in public discourse. The lack of disciplinary action against Wampler further fueled concerns about a lack of accountability within the department. The final theory pointed to a stalker or unknown intruder. The unexplained knocking and doorbell ringing the night Diana Anderson visited suggested that someone was watching or attempting to intimidate. The single footprint, though never analyzed, supported the idea that someone had approached the home undetected. This theory held weight in the absence of other leads, particularly because the house was remote, quiet, and vulnerable to unnoticed entry. However, the loss of the footprint due to rain eliminated what may have been the only physical evidence supporting this possibility. Each of these theories, jealous lover, financial dispute, law enforcement misconduct, and stalking intruder, offered plausible motives, yet none could be confirmed with the available evidence. Polygraph tests, though used, were inconclusive in their overall impact. The early missteps in evidence preservation further weakened the ability to investigate these leads thoroughly. To this day, the Hood River Sheriff's Office has not named an official suspect. Each of the 4 individuals associated with the case has denied involvement, and no new evidence has emerged to shift focus from these original theories. The investigation remains open, but with no arrests, no confessions, and no clear resolution, the mystery continues to loom over the community. What happened in Eric Tamiyasu's orchard home may never be fully understood. The persons of interest remain free, the theories remain unconfirmed, and the case remains unsolved. The murder of Eric Tamiyasu sent ripples through Hood River, Oregon, a place long known for its close-knit community and quiet way of life. Eric was not just a local businessman. He was a trusted neighbor, a friend to many, and someone deeply embedded in the fabric of the town. His death shocked those who knew him, and the unsettling circumstances surrounding it left an enduring sense of unease. For a town unaccustomed to violent crime, the sudden loss and the unanswered questions created a lasting rupture in its collective sense of safety and trust. Initially, many hoped for quick answers. But as the details unfolded, residents began to question how such a serious crime could be handled with what they saw as carelessness. The decision to destroy Eric's bedding, made before an autopsy had been performed, was widely criticized. It represented, to many, a breach of proper investigative protocol. That the order came from the county's highest law enforcement official only deepened the community's concern. People were left wondering whether mistakes had been made out of negligence or something more troubling. As time passed without an arrest or official suspect, frustration grew. The sheriff's office provided few updates, and the silence was interpreted by many as avoidance rather than transparency. Questions about the thoroughness of the investigation persisted. Residents spoke openly about their doubts, not only regarding the outcome, but about the integrity of the process itself. The trust that once defined Hood River's relationship with local law enforcement had begun to erode. Friends of Eric struggled with the lack of closure. Many of them had known him since childhood, had worked with him in the orchards, or had simply shared conversations at community events. For them, Eric's death was personal. The absence of answers meant his memory remained tied not just to who he was, but to what had been done to him, and what had not been done in response. The impact extended beyond grief. It became a collective burden, carried by those who felt the system had failed someone they cared about. Speculation flourished in the vacuum left by official silence. Theories about motives, suspects, and cover-ups became part of everyday conversation. With each passing year, the mystery surrounding B.S. Hill Road only deepened. Some in the community believed justice had been deliberately obstructed. Others simply believed that the initial mishandling of the case had rendered it unsolvable. Either way, the result was the same: an enduring sense that something had gone terribly wrong, and no one had been held accountable. For newcomers to Hood River, the case became a local legend, one whispered about but rarely understood in full. For longtime residents, it remained a wound that never quite healed. Community events that once brought people together now carried a subtle shadow. Conversations about the case often led back to the same questions, asked repeatedly over the years. Why did it happen? Who was responsible? And why had no one been brought to justice? The lack of closure weighed heavily on those closest to Eric. His family, friends, and neighbors were left to remember him in a state of limbo, honoring his life while grappling with the silence left behind. Memorials were held, tributes paid, but there was no verdict, no final statement, no resolution to mark the end of the story. Instead, the community was left with fragments, rumors, unanswered questions, and the enduring image of a man taken too soon. To this day, the case remains open. The Hood River County Sheriff's Office continues to list Eric Tamiyasu's death as an unsolved homicide. No one has been arrested, no suspects have been formally charged, and no new evidence has been brought forward that might change the course of the investigation. The mystery of what happened on B.S. Hill Road still lingers, and for many in Hood River, the echoes of that unanswered crime continue to shape the way they remember not only Eric Tamiyasu, but the trust they once placed in those tasked with delivering justice. More than 20 years have passed since the body of Eric Tamiyasu was discovered in his remote home on B.S. Hill Road. Despite the time elapsed, the case remains officially open and unsolved. No arrests have been made, no charges have been filed, and no suspects have ever been formally named. What began as a puzzling death, initially believed to be natural, later confirmed as homicide, has since settled into the long list of unresolved cases that haunt small communities. There have been occasional moments of renewed attention. Investigators have revisited old interviews, reviewed case files, and re-examined the timeline. But none of these efforts has produced a significant breakthrough. The core facts of the case remain unchanged, and the leads have grown cold. Without new evidence, the investigation has remained in a holding pattern, unable to move forward and unwilling to close entirely. The early missteps in the investigation continue to cast a shadow over any chance of resolution. The decision to destroy the bed and bedding, key potential sources of forensic evidence, still stands as one of the most damaging errors in the case. The footprint seen outside the home, never documented before it was lost to rain, represents another lost opportunity. These critical gaps left investigators without the physical evidence needed to build a conclusive case. The polygraph results from key persons of interest, while publicly noted, did little to advance the investigation. Some were cleared, others remained under suspicion, but no direct connections to the murder were ever proven. Theories, ranging from financial disputes to personal jealousies, persist, but none have been confirmed. With no weapon recovered and no forensic trail to follow, the investigation faces significant limitations. For the Hood River County Sheriff's Office, the case remains a reminder of the delicate balance between procedural accuracy and irreversible decisions. Efforts to regain public trust have included affirming the case's active status and continuing to accept tips, but confidence in the process was severely shaken in the aftermath of the initial response. The passage of time has done little to repair that fracture. For the community of Hood River, the murder of Eric Tamiyasu endures as an unresolved story, etched into local memory. It is not just the crime itself that lingers, but the absence of justice, the questions left unanswered, and the silence that followed the early days of shock and mourning. For many, the case is a symbol of how even in small towns, places defined by familiarity and connection, truth can remain just out of reach. Eric's loved ones have lived with that uncertainty for decades. They have received no closure, no explanation, and no accountability. His life, once marked by generosity, hard work, and quiet leadership, is remembered now alongside the circumstances of his death. The legacy of who he was is inseparable from the story of what was lost. As of today, the murder of Eric Tamiyasu remains one of Hood River's most haunting unsolved crimes. There is no indication that a resolution is near. The trail, once fresh with urgency, has grown faint. Still, the case remains open, not just in official records, but in the minds of those who remember. And the question of what truly happened on B.S. Hill Road remains unanswered.